Hello, everybody. My name is Colleen Johnson, and I am the CEO of ProKanban.org. And welcome to another episode of Kanban for Everyone, where we explore the application of Kanban in areas outside of software development to learn more about how it can help other parts of the business, other parts of the world find flow and how they deliver value. I'm excited for today's topic. This is a new one for me and pretty different from a space that I often think about when I'm thinking about Kanban and how to apply it. And we are going to be talking today about Kanban for finance. So I will be joined today by Christian Wattig. And I think, Christian, we have you here. Welcome. Welcome to the conversation, Christian. Would you take a moment to introduce yourself to our audience?
Hey, Colleen. Thanks for having me today. Sure. So my name is Christian Wattig, and I have 12 years of FP&A, that's financial planning and analysis, and corporate finance experience. And about a year ago, I founded my own company. It's an education company that helps finance teams and business leaders learn financial planning and analysis skills. And I've been running a course on Maven. It's called FP&A Bootcamp. Before that, I worked at large multinational consumer goods companies, Procter & Gamble, Unilever. After my MBA, I moved into tech and worked first at Squarespace. That's a website builder company, led an FP&A team there. And then I moved to DataRails, which is an FP&A software company. And yeah, I'm excited to be here. Happy to talk about how I used Kanban.
Yeah, that's great. So you've got a lot of different experience there, and it sounds like maybe some of the software development side of things trickled over into your financial planning life and maybe course development there as well. So I'd love to just start by really grounding ourselves in what are the common things or common problems that we run into in the finance industry. I mentioned at the beginning here, I don't have a big background in this space, but the first thing that comes to mind for me is regulation and probably a lot of fixed delivery date type of work items. What things do you see as common pain points in the financial space?
Yeah, so when you work in a corporate finance team, there's usually a set schedule for every month because you're doing what we call month-end close, where we look at the numbers from the previous month, we make sure everything looks good, and then we spend time in understanding the variances. We're looking at, okay, why are the actual results different from what we expected, right? Because that's how we can find risks and opportunities for the business and capture learnings. And there's a set schedule to that, so you have fairly tight deadlines, usually around the first half of the month. And then in the second half of the month is often very different for corporate finance teams because all the month-end close work is done, all the mandatory work, if you will. And then it's about projects. So it's about figuring out how can we automate our processes more, how can we find additional metrics that we haven't looked at before to bring better visibility to the business, and how can we help our business partners get a better understanding of where the business is trending.
Okay.
We have these two differences.
Yeah, and so it sounds like not just differences in the cadence of work and the delivery timelines for the work, but also different types of work. So kind of internal versus external delivery of projects or efforts. Okay, great. And so you talked a little bit about stakeholders and when we think about who are you serving from a financial perspective, and I heard a few different things that you just mentioned there. Can you tell us, when you think about who is the customer, who are you delivering value for?
Yeah, so it's usually a mix of different customers, different internal customers. There's, of course, the CFO, right? Because in the end, the CFO is responsible for the books and for the accuracy of the numbers and also for the forecast. So there's always this goal to make sure that they know what's going on, what the current issues are, what the challenges are that the business is dealing with right now, and what impact that may have for the future. But then most corporate finance teams also partner with other departments. So for example, in my career, I spent a long time partnering with the marketing team. I worked with them to measure return on marketing investments, for example. And we worked together on how can we improve the marketing mix and how can we do more with the money we have, right? And then, of course, there's managing the forecast and managing the budgets as well. And other finance teams partner with multiple departments. It really depends on the size of your company. If you're the smaller company, you may be working with pretty much everyone, right?
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a little bit of a scaling opportunity here too, as we start to think about how Kanban can connect those different departments in different areas inside the business.
Mm-hmm.
Christian, you mentioned metrics too as being a big part of the second half of the year for a finance team. I'm sure when we think metrics with finance, we're thinking about are we in the green, are we in the red, are we in the black type of metrics, but do flow metrics fit in at all when you're thinking about the type of data that you're reviewing at month end?
Flow metrics?
Yeah. So are you looking at anything specific from a Kanban's perspective around cycle time, throughput, things like that?
So we look at the time it takes from until we can close the books, and the time it takes until we have fully understood the changes in the numbers, right? So it's always those two big cycles. One is, which is more an accounting task, which the accounting team is usually handling, is, okay, we need to know what the right numbers are. And then once we have the right numbers, there's a second cycle about how can we figure out what they're telling us, right? How to interpret those numbers. And they usually have fairly tight deadlines because they're connected to, if you're a public company, they're connected to the information we're sharing with investors and with publicly. And if you're in a private company, it's more about, okay, making sure that the CEO and other stakeholders have the information they need to make the decision they need at the time they have to.
Yeah. So kind of a big feedback loop, it sounds like.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yep.
Well, we talked a little bit about some of the pain points for finance and some of the different types of work you're juggling, and due dates and deadlines and how that shakes out across the course of the month. Before we talk about Kanban specifically, what are some of the things that you typically see finance organizations try to do to wrangle that work or organize around that work?
So usually you have a lot of structure for the first half of the month or the first week or two, where you have all those external deadlines, if you will, but oftentimes there's very little structure in the second half. And what people struggle with is that how do you prioritize then, and how do you make sure you're not overburdening yourself with too many projects because you only have that limited time. And then as soon as the next month rolls around, you have to drop things, you have to refocus. And so the way people try to address that without using something more sophisticated like a Kanban system is to-do lists, right? Goal setting. You may set quarterly goals, or and try to be more specific in terms of which projects we want to deliver by a certain date. That's usually what people do: to-do lists and goal setting, which I think can get insufficient.
Yeah. Is burnout high in this space? Hearing you talk about the kind of the busyness of the first part of the month makes me think of some teams I've worked with in the past where turnover is high and burnout is high, because even though you get that break in the second part of the month, the first part of the month is so intense that turnover tends to be higher.
It depends. I always think that burnout is more something that's really less due to the demands of the work and more to how the leadership team is managing it, right? And how they're empowering people to manage their own agenda, and how equipped they are, right, with the right tools and the right processes, so that even though there's a tight deadline, it's doable. There's buffer. No one has to stay late on a regular basis. I think it's more about process efficiency and process excellence when it comes to avoiding burnout.
Yeah. Well, let's talk Kanban then. I think you've already started to tiptoe into this a little bit and thinking about, I heard you maybe hint at WIP limits and the volume of things. How do we manage all of that work when you've got potentially a small team or a fixed number of people working towards these deliverables that have fixed deadlines and have to be done by a certain time in the month? So tell us how Kanban starts to fit into this type of work.
Yeah, sure. And just as a primer, I can't say that I have a very sophisticated version of Kanban running, and I haven't gotten much training. A lot of this is self-taught, so it's a very simple version, but it already made a big difference for us. So The context is I was leading the finance department at Unilever for North America logistics. So that's the moving the product from factories to warehouses and from warehouses to the customers. And I had accounting and FP&A report to me in that role. And the challenge was that when I first joined the team, the roles were very siloed. You had some people, the roles were very specialized, and there was very little collaboration between people because there just wasn't any overlap. Like what one person does, the other person is something completely different, and they didn't have a reason really to talk to, and so collaboration wasn't great. And so I restructured the roles and I changed them around so that instead of being vertically organized, they were being organized by country, because they had the US, they had Canada. We also had some locations in South America. And by organizing them that way, they had a lot more overlap because then, yes, it's a different geography that they're supporting, where they're doing the financial analysis on, but the types of analysis that they're doing is the same as other people. And that helped with the collaboration. But what made it difficult and what really led to us implementing the Kanban is that getting more collaboration that worked, but there were imbalances in terms of some people being very, very busy and other people had spare capacity. And it was difficult for me to get the visibility, to see how can we fine tune these roles to make it more equally balanced. And first I tried to see, hey, can I just ask people to write down what they're working on, etc. But they felt a bit micromanaged that way. It can feel, even though this wasn't my intention at all, just wanted to get visibility. I didn't want people to feel micromanaged. And so I looked at different approaches. And Kanban really stuck out to me, and the way we ended up doing it. I'm actually curious to hear, Colleen, you probably know a lot that we could do better or differently, right? But the way we implemented it is we had 5 different columns, if you will, on our Kanban board. We used a software for that. I actually don't remember which software we used, maybe Trello or Asana or something. And the first column was for ideas. The second was for backlog. Then we had work in progress, ready to review, and done. And the way I managed it is the idea stage, everyone can add ideas there, not just me, not just them, everyone can contribute. But then moving things from idea stage into the backlog, only I did that as a manager. Of course, I would talk to people and I would get their recommendation, but in the end, deciding on what should get executed and what should get worked on was a management decision. But then I empowered the team to say, okay, look, this is the backlog. This is how it's prioritized. But you decide when you move what into your work in progress column, right? Because I don't want to micromanage, and I want people to do only as much as they feel they can do based on their workload, because they know their workload best. And then people took it from the backlog, moved it in the work in progress. And then once they're ready to review, they move it into the ready to review column. That's also a column that I couldn't touch. That was really up to them to decide when is it done, when is it ready. And then I reviewed it and moved it from the ready for review to the done column once it's done. And that was done. And it was my little Kanban system.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's a great, it's everything you said, there's really a great place to start, right? And it sounds like you had some policies in your workflow around who could move work and what the conditions were when something was ready to move from one state to the next. I see a question here from one of our listeners that seems like a good time to ask. And Suhail's asking, did you have bottlenecks in that workflow, and what did you do to improve throughput?
Yeah, no, we definitely, there's always bottlenecks, right? There's always ways to improve the process. And the way I was able to see that there may be a bottleneck is if the backlog just keeps growing and the WIP also keeps growing, but there's very little for ready for review, right? And so that's what I really liked about that, is that you have the visibility of how much is in progress, who is working on what, who has how many balls in the air, right, that they're juggling. And then when it moved slower than I thought it would, we would talk about it. And sometimes, then we would go into detail, discover, oh yeah, there's a bottleneck here. Let's see we can do something about that. So it gave you a lot of visibility around that.
Yeah, so it sounds like it was actionable information for your team to organize and for you to step in. Did the team do any kind of daily sync up around the board, or was the board more a tool for you to reach out to people individually?
So we had weekly things. We tried daily stand-ups, but we didn't end up. We did it for a little while, and then we felt like it just wasn't needed. Right, a weekly check-in was fine.
Yeah. And you talked a little bit about kind of specialization that you had on your team, around one person being overloaded and one person not having enough to do. So, how did the board start to help you chip away at that and balance the work across the team more efficiently?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it gave me visibility of what's in progress, right? It's sometimes difficult, and how long things are in progress, right? It's sometimes difficult to keep track of, especially when you have a big team. I had 8 people reporting to me there, and now with the Kanban board, I just took one look and I saw, okay, who had how many different projects, and that was super helpful. And then you can take that and you can have a conversation about, okay, maybe we do need to tweak and fine tune the roles and responsibilities a little bit to give a more to make an adjustment. And sometimes the analysis, the result was that that's just a short time thing. It's not going to be like that for a longer period of time, so we didn't have to adjust the roles. But it really opened up the conversation and made it easier because you had something to look at together and something very concrete to talk about. It made it less, nebulous.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's something I see anytime we apply Kanban, right? Whether it's a new team or a team that's been working together for a long time. I think that visualization of the work and the ability to see everything that's in flight can be a little sobering too. It's like we tend to talk and focus on the biggest things or the most urgent things as a group, but when you can see everything that's going on, you can really start to understand maybe why things aren't moving as fast as you would expect or where those bottlenecks are that need addressed. So that visualization is such an important step in that direction. How about from the perspective of fixed dates? And so you mentioned looking at like volume, right? Is there too much in progress? Is there too much in review? What kind of information did you make visible or leverage to help you understand if you were on track for hitting one of those fixed delivery dates?
So we would also put an expected due date into the work in progress column, and that was an easy way to see, okay, are we on track? And I told people that for the deadlines, so the really external deadlines, also let me know, come to my, like walk over to my desk and let me know ahead of time once we're running late, because I wasn't always looking at the Kanban board, right? So it's maybe not the best, at least maybe maybe there's different software that you can use for that, but for me, it was more of a longer term planning rather than an alert system, if you will.
Yeah. Well, and as the manager of this group, how did this help you communicate with your stakeholders? You mentioned at the beginning, marketing, sales, other parts of the business. How did this help you as a manager?
Yeah, for me as a manager, it was great because it gave me a lot more visibility about what's in progress, and it helped me in 2 ways. It gave me the visibility at a point in time. I could always pull it up, and I always had the latest view. But also over time, it gave me an idea of, if you look at a longer period of time, where do we maybe have too much work, and where could be bottlenecks by doing that longer term analysis as well. So from both of those perspectives, it was very helpful.
Yeah. Did your team ever make any changes to the workflow, or did they stick with those 5 columns?
We stick with those 5 columns. Actually, we didn't end up changing it.
Yeah, that's great. Well, what advice do you have? So you've got a lot of experience here and how this helped you and helped your team. When you start thinking about the courses that you teach and how you help other finance teams and organizations, what types of things do you bring to them, or where would you recommend they start?
So one workshop that I teach is about business partnering, for example, finance business partnering, where it's about how do you build professional relationships, how do you influence people across, because for finance, that's often a big part of the role, is that they're managing budgets with people who are, spending the money, like marketing teams, sales teams, etc. But they don't report to them, right? But still, it's our job to drive budget discipline and, help people do more with the money. And it can be tough if you're always seen as the bad cop, right? If you're always the one who goes in and cuts budgets or takes money away. And so we talk about how can you build the relationships, how can you build trust, and how can you do it, without being the bad cop. And actually, I think that Kanban, in a way, could also be a good tool there, because I always feel like often the reason that different departments don't work well with each other comes down to a lack of communication. Because people don't understand what is everyone's goals, why are they doing that, why are they taking money away. Like if you communicate more around purpose and why and what else we're doing, it can go a long way. And if you have something like a Kanban, it's really easy to share with another team to say, hey, look here, this is where this is what we're working on. This is how everything flows together, and you'll see that this is why we are asking you these questions, because we have all these other bigger projects that link to the strategy, etc., etc. And so that's a big part of what we cover in the course.
That's awesome. Well, we'll make sure we include the link to your course in our show notes on the YouTube channel. So if folks are listening and are interested in learning more about that course, we'll make sure we've got Christian's links queued up there. I see a few more questions in our chat. So Maria has a question. Do you think Kanban could help the wider finance industry to develop the field and move away from the traditional ways of doing things? And if so, how?
Develop the field and move away from the traditional way of doing things. So if you mean with the traditional way of doing things that it's about more number crunching and really just, saying, hey, here's the data, you figure it out, I think Kanban can help, because often it's about not having enough time, right? Because that mandatory process of closing the books is about, you have to do it, and if it takes longer, it takes longer, and then you have less time to do more value-adding work, like business partnering or helping get more visibility of the numbers. And with a system like a Kanban, you can identify bottlenecks, you can improve your throughput, and you can figure out, okay, where are those pain points, and just by bringing more visibility to it. And that then ideally will help speed up those mandatory parts, so you have more time to do other things.
Yeah. And I heard you mention, you don't want to be the bad cop all the time, right? And it sounds like too, when I hear you talk about how Kanban was applied, the process of identifying workflow policies and entrance and exit policies for the columns creates some pretty clear boundaries around how work moves that may otherwise seem kind of fuzzy in the finance space, right? If you're not clear on what has to happen for something to move to ready for review, or how does something get pulled into the backlog. I think that relates a little bit to another question from Sue Hill here, and he's asking, what are the constraints to deliver the done increments? So we've talked about dates and reviews. Are there other constraints from a financial perspective around the work to get that to a done state?
No, I mean, with getting into a done state, what I learned, the most important thing is that the definition of done up front, right? To be very clear about, okay, this is when it's done. And then if you're not there yet, then there's more work to be done, right? And often it's, if you have rework and iterations and things, people think something is done when it isn't. Oftentimes it comes down to lack of communication up front. And usually it's actually my fault when that happens, because, then I didn't explain it well enough what I was looking for and what I was expecting. So that was always a big focus for me, is to be very clear up front about the definition of done.
Yeah. Does batch size factor in for any of this work? And I guess I'm thinking about sharing knowledge, sharing the workload, distributing the workload across the team. Did you have to work with your teams to try to get the work items smaller so that they could move to done sooner? Or is this type of work harder to do that?
Yeah, no, actually it is. And that's actually a great point, because often also in finance, it is helpful to remind people that you need to approach things with an 80-20 mindset, right? There are certain parts where you can't take shortcuts, like the numbers have to be accurate, right? We have to spend the time to check them and to make sure that everything ticks and ties. But especially when it comes to areas like forecasting, and I also have a workshop about that in my course, it's important that people don't get stuck in the details too much and they really think about, okay, how can I spend my time to really get the most from this? And it's usually not always, it shouldn't always be about forecast accuracy, for example. It should be more about how can I understand the reasons why it's off and then talk to the business about that and really get to, okay, what does this mean? What recommendations can we make to the leadership team, to drive the business forward? And so when it comes to batch sizing, yeah, it is important to always think about how can I make this task smaller in the sense of how can I focus more on what really matters and what are the things that I can delay or maybe decide not to do at all because it's just not driving that much added value.
Yeah. I hear we call that continuous reforecasting, what you're mentioning from a Kanban perspective. I'm sure there's some similar parallels there.
Yeah.
It's what you're describing, right? Of it, if it's wrong, let's dig into the reasons why the forecast is changing and adjust it based on that new information instead of holding ourselves to something that may be built on the wrong information or is just no longer feasible.
Right.
Yeah. I'll take your forecasting class. You come take our forecasting class and we'll compare notes here because I'm sure there's a lot of overlap. Well, I'd love to open it up to more questions from our audience here. And as we're giving them a chance to ask more questions, Christian, can you tell us more about recommended references? So obviously we'll post your course here, but tell us what other tools or references you have for our audience to go learn more.
It's a great question. And so in this day and age, I would actually encourage people to see if they can learn from people, rather than from blog posts on the web, because there's a lot of information out on the web and some of it is accurate, some of it maybe isn't. But places like LinkedIn, for example, are great. I actually don't know anyone because I'm not that deep in the Kanban field, but I'm sure there's also people who share what they learned about Kanban on a regular basis on social media, right, on LinkedIn or in other places. And following these people and learning from people who've done it before, taking a course, like the one you're offering is great because it's so important to try and stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Because this is not a new problem. This is something that has been figured out. So I think it's always important that people find the right people to learn from who've been there before.
Yeah, I love that. Well, any questions from our audience here? We'd love to hear from more of you with what questions you have about finance and the application of Kanban for financial work. Christian, another question for you here. What do you see as the biggest barrier? Oh, Maria's got one. We'll ask that one. Sorry, Maria, go ahead. Could finance be more agile, generally speaking?
Oh, absolutely. And that's definitely a big area of, it should be a big focus area for most companies because people get stuck in old ways of working, just because that's how things always have been done. And that's probably not something finance specific, probably happens everywhere. But it's just important to remind people to try different approaches for how things get done. And agile is a great way, to try and be more efficient with your time and be more nimble and flexible. And I also think that the magnitude of change is just accelerating, especially with things like automation and finance. It's a big topic. I think that in 5 to 10 years, the vast majority of manual tasks will be automated. And it doesn't mean that you don't need corporate finance or accounting people anymore, but the focus will be different. The focus will be more on the higher value activities like influencing, analysis, finding insight, separating signal from noise, right? And in order to get there, people need to be more agile and people need to be open to different ways of working, for sure.
Yeah. I was thinking when you were saying that, right, they're both very data-driven spaces, right? Whether it's just Kanban as a whole or financial. And so how do you leverage that data and think about how that impacts your process. And so, you mentioned, we've talked about feedback loops, but being able to leverage that data to say, do these work items need to be smaller? Do we need to organize around this work in a different way? Probably translates in a much more concrete output from a financial perspective, where you're able to see the signals, like you said, signals through the noise. So it's an interesting way to think about it. Along the same lines of that, I see a question here from Jorge. I hope I'm saying your name right, Jorge. Did you confront any pushback on your team when implementing Kanban?
Yeah, so that's a good question too, because what's important is to be really clear about what it is and what it isn't, right? So it shouldn't be a tool to watch people, right, or watch what people are doing, or control people, right? So and people may think that it could be misused as that. So it's important to talk about upfront, why are you doing it? The goal is to help us find bottlenecks, to help us make sure work is balanced, to help us make sure that we're working on the right things at the right time, and which eventually all of that would make them more successful in their job, right? Would make them more impactful and spend their time on things that add more value. So like so many things, it comes down to explaining it right and making sure that people understand, and then also be very careful as the manager, of course, that you're staying within these bounds later on, that you don't use it for things that you didn't give people a heads up about.
Yeah. Well, and I heard that come through too when you were talking about the team having the decision of whether or not something was ready to pull into in progress. The team made the decision about whether something would go to the in review column. And so giving the team that autonomy to make that decision about how work flows, I think also helps, right? It wasn't like you came in with a set of rules and big things that they had to do consistently. You said, here's a structure to help you organize around your work, and I'm going to enable you to pick, kind of pick how the work is going to flow here. So I think that makes a big difference in any implementation. I've got another question here. This one's from Dimitri. What are the issues one should be cognizant of when transitioning to Kanban from finance from regular FP&A?
So issues when transitioning to Kanban. The one we just mentioned, right, about making sure that people understand what it's for, what it's not for. I didn't have any. If you use it correctly, and you use it in a way that it doesn't interfere with your set deadlines that are already there, I can't think of any other issues. Can you think of anything, Colleen?
Yeah, I guess I would be curious about the regulatory side of things. If you have to deal with any kind of audit or regulatory type of things where the work has to go outside of your team to get reviewed, does that ever present any challenges or blockers?
That's a good question, but it really doesn't, because when you're introducing a system like that, you're not changing the outputs, right? You're just changing how the work flows, how you're managing the work, how you're looking at it. The output still needs to be in compliance with all those regulatory guidelines and need to be shared in the right ways. But how you go about internally of managing that isn't of any concern for if anything, if there was an auditor on site and they see how structured you are with managing your work, they would actually appreciate that.
Yeah. How about inside of the organization? Do you see that there's blockers? We talked about a little bit about marketing and sales and other places where data is either coming to the finance group or going out of the finance group for those other teams to consume. Do you ever run into any blockers across the organization that way?
I mean, the challenge can be if you work for a larger company where, and if it's something that you're bringing to your particular team, then the others aren't trained on it and they may not fully understand it, right? They may not know the objectives there, and they may be less willing to participate. But that again comes down to communication and training. But that were some challenges that I've seen. You need to make sure that you need to understand that if someone has never dealt with that before, there is some explaining to do. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense. Jorge has another question for you, and I promise I didn't pay him to ask this. It says, although you are self-taught, have you considered obtaining a formal Kanban education in order to see what improvements, if any, can be made?
I may at some point. I haven't put much thought into it, but good question.
Yeah. We've got a comment here too. It says, thank you, Christian, for discussing your experience. It's great to see more examples of how Kanban can help improve the flow of work outside of the dev world. Good luck in your Kanban journey.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great sentiment too. I think as we talk about a lot in the Kanban space, it's never really something that we implement and we're done with. And so leveraging data, leveraging feedback from other parts of the organization to identify those opportunities for improvement really becomes part of how we keep refining our systems. Is there, with the teams that you've worked with, do they do any kind of retrospective or data review on their systems to look for those opportunities?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of retrospectives and looking backwards. It's something that easily gets missed because you're always on to the next thing, and there's so much on people's schedule, and people are busy. And so that's always something that I also put into the backlog is, okay, we need to pause and look back and reflect. How did this go? Usually there's always things that you can improve when it's a complex project or a process that involves multiple departments over a longer period of time. The challenge is just to do it, right? To really have the discipline to say, okay, I know we have all these other urgent things going on, but we'll set this deadline, and by then, we'll do the look back and the review, and then we just have to stick to the deadlines that we set to ourselves. That's really the discipline you need, because you can learn so much from doing that.
Yeah. It's always an interesting argument I hear in our industry that Scrum requires more discipline than Kanban, or that Kanban's looser and doesn't have as many rules as Scrum, because I think it does require a lot of discipline in slightly different ways, right? The constraints in the system are different, but it still requires a lot of discipline on the part of the team itself. So I love that. Well, Christian, any closing thoughts for our audience on Kanban or finance in general?
On Kanban, I would just encourage people to give it a try, because it's just a great way to bring more visibility and structure to your work. And if it doesn't work for you, you don't have to stick with it, right? It's not.
Yeah.
You don't need to make a big investment. It's not a fancy software you need for that. You don't need much. You could even just do it with Post-it notes and a board, if you know how to do it. And yeah, for finance people out there, if you want to learn more about financial planning and analysis, take a look at my course. I'm teaching it live, so it would be a similar discussion as Colleen and I have here with a group of students, because I feel like it's very important to have people in the room and be able to ask questions and be able to practice things and be able to really work on things together as a group in breakout sessions, because that's in the end how you learn. And yeah, so thanks a lot for having me, Colleen.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Christian. And as we said, we'll make sure we get Christian's course linked up in our show notes here. As always, thanks for joining us. Thanks for sharing your story. We love hearing these conversations and these different ways of thinking about how to apply flow outside of software development. So we really appreciate you joining us for the show today. We'll be back again in 2 weeks on November 1st. We're working through our show. We had to shuffle a few shows around, so to be continued on the topic for that show. But if you ever have any ideas or things you'd like to see featured on Kanban for Everyone, you can add it to the comments here or reach out to us directly on LinkedIn. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a great day.